And I would like to address what I think is a theme that has run through many of these different presentations, which is the relationship between class and race. And I would say to you that I think many of you know. If you don't know, I will now inform you that about 2 months ago, the Civil Rights Project at UCLA issued a report which found that New York State had the most segregated public schools in the nation, and that New York City was a significant driving force in that status. And I will tell you, as someone who spent virtually all my life in New York City, except for my post-secondary education and the last 18 months I've been here at Shanker, that is not something that I find rather tasteful. The fact that New York City and New York State schools should be more segregated than the schools in Mississippi. I will tell you, one of the things that is interesting about segregation in New York City schools is that the middle class schools are integrated. So where there are middle class kids, you will find remarkable degrees of racial integration. The schools that are segregated are the schools serving poor communities, and they are segregated by both class and race. They are schools serving poor black and brown kids. And there's a way in which we don't even have a language to describe this. I think we need a language, like to call this extreme segregation, because there is a way in which that type of segregation is far more pernicious than the segregation of Jim Crow era, where in a segregated school you would have all of the social classes of the African American community. And so you would not have this incredible intensification and concentration of segregation. And it makes, I would argue, the task of education and the task of those young people creating meaningful, purposeful lives for themselves all that more difficult. So let me just ask the panel members, those of you who would like to respond to this, what should we make of the fact that segregation in America now has this intensification of race and class together? And what exactly do we need to do to address that?
So I think you make a really important observation, Leo, that we all naturally think of the Jim Crow segregated schools as worse because there wasn't even the pretense of choice in the matter. And some people, including some African American educators, say that the de facto racial segregation today is of less concern because there is this element of volition in some cases. But your point is so much more powerful. People ask me, well, what about the great all-black schools during Jim Crow? Those were socioeconomically integrated, almost always. So you had black doctors' sons and laborers' daughters sitting side by side. And that helps explain why those schools had some measure of success. So I think your point is a really profound one. And I think there are clearly some important steps we can take in a variety of contexts. I'm glad, Mike, that you raised the issue of integrated charter schools. They can be a force for, if structured properly, can be a force for good. I would also like them to have some teacher voice and the opportunity for teachers to participate through unions or other means. But those are the ones that are likely to be most successful. Mike, you mentioned the Boston charter schools. Well, the Boston charter schools are an interesting case. They are quite successful on standardized test scores. They're also far more economically integrated than the traditional Boston public schools. So when they do these randomized controlled studies where lottery winners and lottery losers are compared, and you are controlling for race and class and all these other issues, what they don't control for is the fact that the charter school population in Boston, not in every place, but in Boston is quite a bit more privileged than the traditional public school students. So it would be shocking if the students who lotteried into these schools didn't do better than those who lost. So I'd like to see us, take on this issue much more aggressively. I wouldn't argue for 95% socioeconomic integration and 5% reform. I'd be happy with, if we move the needle so that 20% of the discussion were about the fact that segregation was so devastating. But right now, it's just not on the radar screen.
Couple of points. First of all, building on what Rick said, I think we should study why is it in a place like Boston, do we see many of the, say, middle-class minority families or working-class minority families seeking out those charter schools? And I would suspect that it's because those schools are providing something they really want and that are serving their children well. And that includes very rigorous academic preparation, a college track, et cetera. We've had this ideology in a lot of our public schools, and I feel for the schools. They've been told that you cannot do any ability grouping, you cannot do any tracking. I mean, all of these things that we've had this sort of ideological attack on allowing these schools to say, hey, if you've got kids, whatever their race or socioeconomic status, who are ready to be accelerated, to take challenging courses, we're not going to let that happen in our schools. That's been a big problem, and I think that has driven many of those families out of those schools. And one of the interesting things about the tracking and ability grouping development is that suburban schools, by and large, have not detracked. Certainly not to the same degree as urban schools, partly because, frankly, the parents there won't stand for it. Right, and they have the political power to keep it from happening. Where it's happened, it's been in the urban areas, and so I would argue it's the high-achieving kids in urban schools who are the ones who don't have the opportunity to be in a classroom where they can move at a fast pace, where they can be challenged to the fullest of their potential. They are told that you have to be in heterogeneous classrooms with kids of all ability groupings, and parents figure out over time that that's not a good option for their kids. Second point, now that I've made a lot of people in the room angry, is I think we have to be careful about the storyline that some people like Gary Warfield say that our schools are increasingly segregated. Some of that is simply a matter of changing demographics in our schools. There are fewer white students every year. And so, just watching that play out, if nothing else changes, you're going to have more and more schools that have a high concentration of non-white students. And so we just have to be careful about how we do that metric. And I think, look, there's still a great amount of concentration of poverty and concentration by race. There's no doubt about it. But I think that storyline that has gotten worse is very misleading. And I think, look, I think that particularly on the side, it does not help the case for people to say things like, charter schools are increasing segregation in this society, right? When a fair look says that most charter schools mirror the demographics of their neighborhood public schools. And in neighborhoods where there is concentrations of poverty, then the charter school has a concentration of poverty as well.
They chose to locate it in a segregated neighborhood.
Right.
They could choose to be more integrated. Yeah.
We're going to take questions from the floor. And we're going to, when I recognize you, we're going to go to the back to the yellow sweater there. When I recognize you, someone will appear with a microphone.
All right. Hey, Mike. So you won't be surprised. I'm just going to start off by agreeing with you on one point and then totally disagree with you on everything else. So I'll harness the energy in the room. Elaine Weiss from the Broader Bolder Approach to Education. I'll start out by agreeing with you that it is absolutely hard to get education and education policy right. And I think I'll have to end the agreement there on a couple things. So first of all, just so you know, I think you're talking to the wrong teachers. Those teachers who are telling you that differentiation is bullshit, and I'll go ahead and use your word. We're now in our 7th year of public schools in Montgomery County, extremely diverse schools. One of them, I think, is the highest farms rate school in the entire county. More than half the kids don't come from English-speaking homes. Every classroom both my daughters have been in has done an amazing job on differentiation, and I say that as apparently the parent you are citing, as I have a daughter who read 3 Harry Potters in kindergarten and is in class with kids who came to class not knowing their ABCs, and she's doing awesome, and they're both doing awesome, and I think that works. So I think, I'm not saying this is easy, I'm saying it's not nearly as difficult or rare as you suggest, and I, again, I think those of us, and there's a bunch of us who came from next door, heard that all of this is hard work. Getting accountability right is hard work. Getting reform right is hard work. I don't think our response is, well, then let's just do it wrong. I think our response is, well, then let's work hard. I think, I'm just going to pick up on Leo real quickly. Saying that these reforms, again, are easier than the alternative is absolutely true. Saying that they're making progress is, to paraphrase you, bullshit. As we heard next door, poor and minority kids, frankly, in particular, have not done all that well under the last 20 years. And if we look at NCLB, they certainly did not do as well as they did before NCLB. So, just sort of as a big old benchmark to look at. Number 3, in terms of the high-achieving charters, I point to Rick. I just think we need to be much more careful what's going on. In particular, we need to be careful about what they're measuring. So to the extent that schools, those so-called no excuses schools, are only focused on and only measuring test scores, it's not a huge surprise that they can bump up test scores. I think the question for us is, do middle-class parents accept that as okay? And should any of us be accepting that as either the only thing schools do or the only measure that they use? And I think most of us would say no. That's not what we want our kids to be doing, and that's not what we believe public education and citizenship is about. I don't know which schools you're talking about that aren't tracking. It is true that many urban schools don't offer AP classes for Black kids and poor kids, so in that sense, maybe that counts as not tracking, but that's not what I think you were talking about. And I guess my question at the end of all of this is, what should we do? I am firmly, obviously, in the Rick Collenberg camp. I'm for the options. I'm for all that. I think we have to be awfully careful about how we do choice, because as we have seen in New York City, that kind of choice, as is happening in DC, does seem to be exacerbating segregation for reasons that aren't very hard to detect. So the question I would pose is, in addition to all the options we're offering, how does housing play into all of this, as it has in Montgomery County?
So I'm going to give members on the panel a chance to defend their honor, but before we do that, I'm in the interest of having more dialogue. I'm going to hit a number of people in the audience in a row, right here.
I'm Sean Hartnett, and I'm actually chief of schools with Center City Public Charter Schools here in D.C. Been in the D.C. region for about 5 years now. Would be interested in your thoughts on this. I'm quite interested in this conversation. Not quite sure that I agree or disagree that integration is the answer, because I think that there are implications beyond just, Black and brown, poor or middle class kids being in schools with each other. I was the beneficiary and also the victim of integration. I was in Rochester, New York, and went to schools when the schools in Rochester were desegregated. And I got some feelings about that 30 years later, I want you to know. And I have a brother who's older than me who really was the pioneer. He thought his middle name was nigger for a while. So going to schools with white people who aren't ready for you, got a few feelings about that. So I am here in D.C. now, and I'm watching. In my role, I was approached very recently by a prominent member of the Public Charter School Board asking me to consider what it would take for one of my schools that is located in Capitol Hill, where the entire community has, it's gentrified, what it would take to make one of my schools appealing for white families to come to. I got some feelings about that too. And so I didn't answer the question because I wasn't prepared to answer the question at that time. But I did have this experience. In the 5 years I've been here, I've had quite an interesting employment experience and have had the opportunity to see several of these schools, charter schools in particular, who are quite kind of, doing the mixed thing. And what I have found quite interesting about them is when you go into the pre-K 3, pre-K 4, the K and 1, you see all the mix. And then at around 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, the white families pull their kids out. Two well-known charter schools in this city in particular, when you look at their elementary school and you look at the middle school, it is shameful. And so I'm trying to figure this out. I'm trying to figure out, how do we make white and middle-class families ready? Because the answer, as I've talked to some of the white people in the community where that school is, what they have said to me in a veiled way is that I need to get some of the black kids who are poor out of the school for it to be attractive enough for them to, one, come, and if I wanted them to stay, that I'd have to get even more of those poor black kids out. So I'm trying to, I am struggling with this. I'm struggling with this and being rather vulnerable, because some of you know me and you'll probably go back, I don't care. I'm struggling with this, and I need to figure out what we do because of the experience that I had. Again, I benefited significantly from it, but there are some other sides to it, and I do not want to, in this leadership capacity, visit upon poor black children that experience.
Right here. Your comments. Wait for the mic, because... No, you do, because people out in the live streaming won't hear you.
Good afternoon. My name is Ajawa Butwi Asamoah, and I'm not representing any particular organization. I was noting that my question is probably, your comments were a segue from my question, and I pose this to the panel. I'm interested in knowing how you think the current discourse surrounding integration would be impacted had separate but equal actually occurred.
Okay, let's take a shot at it, panel.
My experience in Little Rock at the time was that basically the Little Rock School Board was too poor to be able to afford separate but equal. And so items like the football stadium, we shared the stadium. Horace Mann played on Friday nights, Central played on Saturday nights. Now, obviously, for me, being exposed even from the outside to that facility made me think, what could they be doing in a building that was 4 times the size of the school that I attended? What was the difference? And I think, most Southern communities, they didn't make any pretense to have separate but equal. I mean, it was something they mouthed, but had no intention. Maybe you had outstanding schools. Dunbar here, Paul Lawrence Dunbar at Little Rock was regarded as an outstanding black high school. But again, without looking at both housing construct and employment opportunities, it seems to me this is always going to be mired and stuck in a situation where there's no opportunity, a limited opportunity. I always said the 9 of us, the backgrounds were ranging from school teachers to porters, but the common thread for all of the families were that somebody in the family believed that education was this key to the future, and that's why I think at the end of the day, we need to have income equality as well as racial equality, because motivating somebody and seeing what the opportunities are is the American dream. And Professor Ganir made the point, and I think what we fail to recognize is that the 54 decision in many Southern communities provided greater opportunity for whites than it did for blacks. I mean, they weren't getting into the University of Arkansas, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, any more so than it was always a class issue. And the civil rights movement, it seems to me, has missed an opportunity to show how it did provide a broader participation for a larger group than just the African American community.
Could I say one thing in direct response to your question, which is Charlene Hunter Galt was one of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit challenging the segregation of university in Georgia. And initially, she was recruited to desegregate a college that's in Atlanta. And she was either the top person or was magna, and the gentleman was ahead of her. But the two of them were considered the plaintiffs. And they took her to the college in Atlanta that was the white college and said, this is the school we're going to desegregate. And they looked at the syllabus, and Charlene said, we've already studied all of what they're teaching in first year. We don't need to go to this school. So in terms of your question, that was an all-black school with excellent teachers and with a range of students, but based on middle class, well groomed and supported. And so I do think that this is, in some ways, W.E.B. Du Bois's point.
In response to your question, I always feel it's important to remember that racial and ethnic integration or non-integration is a remedy. The goal is equal educational opportunity and higher achievement. Integration versus non-integration is often pitted against each other in terms of whether you're in favor of one or the other. I believe that the goal is equal educational opportunity. Integration and non-integration are like two wings of a bird or a plane, and they're operating in unison to achieve the educational goal. I do feel, though, who has been in the trenches of equal educational opportunity for the past 4 decades of my career in the law, that race and class are the new Jim Crow segregation of the 21st century, and that the achievement gap between poor and non-poor, racial and ethnic minorities, English language learners, many children with disabilities, are the new form of educational challenge in this century. And that one of the first goals, regardless of integration or non-integration, I happen to favor integration, is to lift up the bottom quartile. Mm-hmm. And that all bleeds into the whole structural aspect of race and class, some of which Attorney General Holder touched upon so weeks ago at the anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education. All of it is reflected in the school-to-prison pipeline, the statistical disparities about the dropout rates, the graduation rates, the number of children in the juvenile detention system leading into the criminal adult system, the disproportionate amount of people of color in prison for nonviolent drug offenses. All of that stems from the lack of an education. And a lot of it is the result of children, particularly in the bottom quartile. And so you may be surprised, but a number of us in the civil rights movement think that the No Child Left Behind, don't throw your shoe at me now, is the greatest civil rights legislation for education, not because of all of the bad factors about the standardized testing frenzy and about the labeling, but because it's singled out as the subgroup, the least performing in a system that in the past had been masked by the performing to reach the result of an achieving district. And now no district is considered performing unless their subgroup are performing.
Rick, and then Michael.
That's dangerous, but okay. A couple of quick points. Elaine, on your questions, number one, differentiated instruction is difficult but possible, and I'd cite as my source Mike Petrilli's fine book, where he talks about BCC High School in Bethesda Chevy Chase High School, and the fact that they have honors classes which are wide open, but where students go at different paces, and it seems to be working pretty well, according to Mike, right? Yeah. Second point, I'm glad you raised housing, that the reason Montgomery County was able to integrate the schools was because of an inclusionary zoning program that so when a builder develops a certain number of units, she has to set aside a proportion of those units for low-income and working-class families, and that ultimately is a way to reconcile Mike's passion for neighborhood schools and integration. So I think we should be paying a lot more attention to that. On your great point about the costs that African Americans faced with school integration, no one would deny that horrible things were done to African American students in integrated settings by white people. The only and no one would excuse it, but I would point out that the outcomes for students in terms of their life chances were found in study after study to be better. And when you ask students in like the METCO program in Boston, which gave urban students a chance to go to suburban schools, would they do it again? 90-some% would, not because it was easy, but because they felt it improved their life chances. Last thing I'll say is that on this question of whether separate can be equal. Well, you said if separate but equal had worked. Yeah. Well, let me answer the question I'm interested in answering rather than your question then, because that'll have to give some more thought to. Separate, I wanted to stand up and applaud during Lonnie's comments because she really put her finger on it, that this has to do ultimately with inequalities of resources and power, and that so long as we have separate schools for rich and poor, which correlates with black and white, they won't be equal. They'll never be equal. And so rather than ignore that reality and try to spend all of our attention focused on increasing the opportunities in those high poverty schools, maybe we should take steps to reduce the number of high poverty schools. We've done that in housing, where high-rise concentrated poverty housing was demolished, and people in Chicago and elsewhere were given opportunities to go to more integrated schools in the suburbs, and the programs were quite successful. So I just hope that that'll be part of the conversation.
Great. Well, look, a couple of things, I guess mostly to Elaine. First of all, let's talk about the KIPS and the no excuses a little bit. I think we need to all try to hold ourselves accountable for this. Let's root for anything out there that seems to be working for kids, and let's root for it to succeed. Now, look, I know that on the reform side, we have not always done that. I know, for example, that in the debates around things like tenure reform and teacher evaluations, when the unions would say, hey, look at some of these peer review plans that are doing really good work, the reformers would want to make the case that, no, they're not actually firing anybody or they're not actually doing any good, right? That was wrong, right? Same thing here, okay? You go into a KIPP school in this city, and you'll see that they are doing phenomenal things, and they're teaching in a very robust way that would make you proud, all right? And when you look at their outcomes, Elaine, it's not just the test scores, right? Their college going and college graduation rates are incredible. Now, they will say they still have a long way to go, but please don't root for them to fail, okay? The second thing is on differentiation. Montgomery County is probably among the most high-capacity systems in the country, right? So it is possible, and I have written about it in the book, also an Education Next article all together now, where you can look and see how this can be done well. So I should be careful. It can be done well. I think it's really hard. And even in Montgomery County right now, though, you're seeing a huge backlash where the district is saying we're going to do less math acceleration in the elementary grades. They used to have a policy under Jerry Weiss that encouraged a lot of kids, if they were ready to go a grade level ahead, 2 grade levels ahead, go for it. They've dialed that back, sometimes for good reasons, but there's a lot of resistance to that, right? And this issue, I mean, look, I think the reformers don't get this either. No parent wants their kid to be sitting in class not challenged, right? And that includes parents of high-achieving kids, again, regardless of their race or social status. And yet our education system, we've had this ideology that says, those kids' needs don't matter as much, or they'll be fine, or it's okay if they don't learn much today because they're high achieving. And that is not a tenable situation. All right, so we've got to, I just really think we got to wrestle with that, even in Montgomery County. And then finally, this argument that things haven't gotten better for poor and minority students. I mean, look at the NAEP data, right? Now, Matt DiCarlo's in the room, so I don't want to be accused of misnapery, so we have to be careful with this. But you see, since the mid-'90s, huge improvements for African-American and Latino students on the NAEP, particularly in math, but also in reading. 2 to 3 grade levels of improvement in math, 1 to 2 grade levels of improvement in reading. Now, the debate can be why? Why did those scores go up so much? They went up the most dramatically in the late 90s. I would argue the best evidence is that was with the onset of the test-based accountability systems. And other studies have shown that states that were early adopters to test-based accountability got a huge bump in the late 90s. The other states got a big bump after No Child Left Behind. It has since started to phase out and plateau. So now we need something else. Hasn't gone down. Those scores continue to go up more slowly, but they continue to go up. Look at the data. All right, now, my view is we need something new to get the next bump. I think Common Core has potential if we implement that well. That's about bringing capacity back into the system. Okay, but don't rewrite history. Some very good things have happened for the bottom quartile of students in the last 20 years. Now, again, it may not be all the reformy stuff. A new study out of New Jersey showed that increased spending was a big factor in increased achievement in New Jersey. Okay, let's hold hands and I'll take credit for it, all right? But let's not pretend that things have not gotten better, and let's be careful about getting rid of the things that may be helping to make things better. That's all.
Okay, let's do another round of questions. I saw someone over here. Let's start with Cliff.
Clifford, Janie. Leo, I wanted to thank you about your reference to so much reform and so little change. And I wanted to challenge the panel to explain why we continue to look at education reform in a bubble. That is, we separate out the inequalities that exist in our healthcare system, in our housing stock, in our employment, inequality income ratios. And do you think that the next big in education would be sufficient to bring about the kind of change that's necessary, whereby we have community choice, not just schools of choice?
Other questions? In the back.
Hi, Bernie Bond, Albert Shanker Institute. There's a lot of what Mike has talked about that I actually agree with, but one of the big things, as a fellow Montgomery County public school parent, that I find problematic, not so much in Montgomery County schools, is not that advanced students are given the opportunity to move ahead. It's what is not being done for those students who are left behind. Now, you talked about, for example, KIPP and some of the other schools that show improved test-based scores in terms of closing the achievement gap. But one of the things Matt has pointed out in Shanker blog that those schools do is provide, sometimes the equivalent of 50% more time. Are you advocating that those kinds of resources be dedicated to poor students across the nation?
Okay, let's go to are there any other questions? All right, one more here. We'll go to the panel.
Thanks. I'm Beth Glen. Listening to some of the panelists, I was just reflecting on the recent news reports out of Shelby County, Tennessee, and that's the district around Memphis. And they recently had a sort of radical socioeconomic integration when the Memphis City school system actually dissolved and is now part of the of Shelby County, and their response has been to form this portfolio strategy of choice schools and a focus on test-based accountability that really seems like it's going to allow them to justify closing schools for either being underchosen or underperforming. And it just made me sort of think that, this sort of resorting into categories and the impetus to rank and sort through education, whether it comes under the guise of choice, whether it comes under the guise of test-based accountability, whether it comes under the guise of tracking, isn't it really, they're all just ways of reinscribing, reinforcing privilege and reinscribing the inequality that they were, initially designed to try and remedy.
Here.
Sorry, thank you.
Okay, let's go to the panel. Anybody who wants to respond to these questions?
As one of the few remaining here, I'll respond quickly. Cliff, I think your question is a great one. What's the next big thing? We haven't talked at all about pre-K here. That seems like an enormous opportunity for us, and is something that should be pursued. I'd mention even here, there's research on the value of having a mix of kids of different backgrounds, different socioeconomic backgrounds in particular. Jean Reed at Teachers College Columbia has done some powerful research on that issue. Unfortunately, Head Start is designed as a means-tested program, so it's economically segregated, but there are more powerful results when we can integrate them. And in terms of the question about Shelby County and Memphis, to my mind, the merger of the two districts represents an enormous opportunity, potentially, because that's what's, the really successful programs for the improve outcomes for kids are in places like Wake County, where Raleigh and the surrounding suburbs are one district, Jefferson County, Kentucky, where Louisville and the surrounding district are one, and there are great opportunities for really providing a terrific education for all students. But obviously, it matters how the merger goes and how the programs are implemented. And if you have a choice program with no goal of equity, then you're not likely to see success. You'll just see further stratification. And that's why it's so important to have what Michael Alves calls fairness guidelines, where choice is associated with a purposeful effort to provide all kids better opportunities and the chance to have a quality integrated school environment. And so that's the second key component. Merger by itself is not enough.
Mike?
I guess just briefly to Bernie's question, sure. I mean, I definitely think that longer school days and school years is a very promising strategy. Those charter schools find a way to do that, even with less funding in general than their nearby district schools. Now, in some cases, they raise a lot of money privately, but that's not always the case. And so, as the conservative, let me just make the point that there are trade-offs. And so, if you want to have longer school days and longer school years, we should have that. And we should absolutely be spending more money on schools that are high-poverty schools and where a lot of poor kids go, absolutely. But that means that also looking hard at things that we're spending money on that may not be as effective and redirecting those resources.
Okay. Randy wanted to come by and say a few words, but she's not here. All right. So let me just thank everybody for coming out, and let me thank the members of the panel for what I think was a very informative and good discussion.